Good morning, Arun sir.
Good morning, Professor.
We'll start in 2 minutes. Sir.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, Professor.
Good morning. Yeah.
Good morning to everyone. Now I request Ms. Shashireka to introduce our chief guest.
Good morning, one and all. I, D. S. Shashireka, Assistant Professor in Department of Mathematics, Dayanand Sagar College of Engineering, Bangalore. Welcome you all for the 4th day of Atal FDP on Computational Mathematics and Artificial Intelligence for Engineers. I would like to introduce the speaker of this session, Dr. Arun Gopalan sir. Sir is Vice President, Data Science at EY, Bangalore. Prior to this, he was a Director of Research at Deep Value, an US-based algorithmic trading firm. He has focused on data science in different domains. Sir has a BTech in Meteorology from IIT Madras, India, and PhD in Material Science from RPI, New York, USA. He was a great research at NIST, Maryland, USA, as a part of his postdoctoral research. At EY, he has built the data science team and the predictive analytic platform. He led the invention of an AI algorithm that identifies the risk factor and the population at risk for various medical procedures and diagnosis. And also, he is on the board of studies for the CTA department at CIT Coimbatore and was instrumental in setting up the syllabus for the integrated MSc data science courses. Now I request the session speaker, Dr. Arun Gopalan sir, to give his presentation. Over you to sir.
Thank you, Professor, for the kind introduction. Can I share the screen?
Yes, sir.
Can you all see the screen?
Yes, we are able to see, sir.
Okay. So today's topic is mathematics in machine learning and artificial intelligence. Yesterday I spoke about mathematics in data science and machine learning. I would like this to be a standalone session as much as possible. So initially bear with me for a few minutes while I review some of the basic introductory material that I did last time. Then we will move on to a few topics. Last time there were a lot more topics. This time I reduced the number of topics, but in a bit more depth. I just want to go a bit more slowly and then in more depth. So to begin with, So what is the agenda here? What is machine learning? First, we'll talk about what is machine learning and artificial intelligence. What are the math skills for ML AI roles and tasks? How can mathematics faculty guide students for ML AI careers? I'm going to assume that there are at least a few of you have not attended last time, but keeping in mind that there will be quite a bit of overlap, I'm just going to keep it to a few minutes, the first three parts. Then I'm going to go over a few machine learning and AI topics, which I think are important. And then just a review of what went on, right? So what is machine learning? What is artificial intelligence? So machine learning is a combination of data science, mathematics, computing, and other things, right? Other things I put epsilon just as a if you will, a joke, where epsilon is usually a residual, but it's not really a residual here. There's a lot of things going on there. So I drew the line at nonlinear learning methods, right? It's, every practitioner will have his own view. This is a reasonable view to hold. Otherwise, what we end up doing is, I noticed papers which is a strictly the paper itself was a good paper based on statistics, statistical modeling. That suddenly got upgraded in the. It did not make any great claims. This was a European journal, right? And then the press release of the university made it sound as if it's machine learning. It's not even machine learning; it's just pure statistics. And then, by the time it hit the press, it became AI. Right. So AI is a superset of machine learning, and there's a whole lot of overlap with data science and statistics. So I just want to draw one line, if you will, for classifying them. Right. One line is a nonlinear learning methods. But the important thing is, there's a lot of mathematics and computing, right? And since the mathematics has been encoded, if you will, into coding, computing becomes even more important, right? And of course, we need a lot of data. And where are we using it? We are using it as a classification. We're using it for prediction of behavior of systems, materials, biological, and stochastic system. Material system, I myself have used in material science, bioinformatics, biology, biological system. People have used it, and stochastic systems. For financial, again, I have some background in finance, so we have used it, right? So going ahead, what is artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is a lot more mathematics and a lot more computing and actions, right? Again, this is one factor I think distinguishes it from the data science and machine learning, where AI, the system itself takes action. If at the end of all the data science you don't take any action, then there's no point, or in machine learning there's no point, right? But here the system itself takes actions. For example, autonomous driving, the system takes by the very definition, the system takes the decision, right, to act. And behind it is for autonomous driving, for example, behind it is computer vision and robotics, right? So it has to see the road, it has to understand what it is, and there is a lot of machine learning on that front. There's also the science of vision and so on. Robotics in order to move, right? So how do you combine them, right? It's all typically driven, a whole lot of it is driven by deep learning. But whatever it is, it's AI in the sense that it is able to make sense of the environment and do a job better than humans, perhaps, but definitely a very complex endeavor where it involves machine learning and AI, right? So what distinguish what I am saying is the distinction between one of the distinctions between AI and machine learning is the actions, right? Again, epsilon does not really mean residual. It is just other things that each person can add, right? And we are going to go over two techniques in that, right? AI/ML, deep learning and graphical models, right? Today. we are going to go over the basic of them. We are not going to do, autonomous driving or robotics or computer vision, right? This is the what we are going to go over is basically the basic math, the fundamentals of deep learning, the fundamentals of graphical models, right? That sets you up for the next level, right? You meaning like anybody who's unfamiliar with the field and the students, right? So it's just I'm opening the door. So not all topics can be covered. I want to make sure the basics are covered in a more detailed manner than yesterday. Okay. So what are the math skills for MLAI roles and tasks, and how can math faculty guide students? Right. So particularly for any AI, actually I forgot to add one more, right? If you look at all the AI systems, they need a lot of data, right? So the overall ecosystem involves a labeling, right, for real life. So the labeling by itself is and yes, they are trying to do automated labeling so that the classifier label, right, essentially, right, that itself is a heavily manual task, which is they are trying to replace it or minimize that, but that involves a lot of humans, right? Even though it's AI, even though you are doing ML, it is not operating in a vacuum, right? No, I have not put any labeler here, right? I'm just focused on that team that has core ML AI roles, right? You have to understand this is not in a vacuum. Units in the company, right? You are heavily dependent upon data pipelines, right? And the company is dependent upon others for getting the data, right? So data is the blood of this, so we really need to keep those going. But I'm just looking at the core team, right? And the core team itself is not, one would assume, looking at the general description, that it's heavily math oriented. Yes, there is math, absolutely, right? That's why we are here, right? But it is also heavily data oriented, right? Now they are moving towards data centered AI, right? Fine, you got a model, but how do you work on it using the data available, right? So anyway, so what does it all mean, right? That the mathematics is not 100%. Mathematics is definitely the core of AI or ML. But for it to work, it's just saying it's you could even say it's a heart or the lungs, right? Yeah, sure, without it you cannot function, but just putting a heart also does not make any sense, right? It won't work on its own. A heart or the lung will not work on its own, right? So please keep that in mind. The reason I keep emphasizing it is because they have to know their role, and then accordingly you're working within that system, right? So you have managers, you have software engineers, you have data engineers who most likely do not have the math skills, right? So the data analysts, data scientists, and the AI researchers will have the math skills. And even here it's going to vary quite a bit in terms of the training. Somebody could be very smart, but they may not have trained, right? And it is important that, one thing is important is at the AI level, if you want to do math, then the math has to be extremely good. On coding level, you have to be curious and have coding level. The thing is, for AI, if you are going to have that level of math, then you should have done most of your math, the fundamentals in college. Yes, you do come and learn, but I'm sure that everybody would agree that it gets tougher to learn as you grow older, right? And among the toughest subjects to learn more of, as you grow older, is math. So it is imperative that they start off with anybody getting into MLAA start off with a very strong math background in college, right? I mean, I know it depends upon them, the students, not really on the faculty, but like, I just like to emphasize that because I see people struggling to make sense out of like, basic math concepts which are essential, but they don't know how, right? So anyway, so these are the skill levels that is required. And as a percentage of people who need in the system who need high math level skills is fairly low. Okay, and for the tasks, right? Any research group will be creating new MLA techniques and algorithms. But the interesting thing is like now the lab to prod pathway is like really fast. It is unbelievably fast. The 3-4 years back, I was doing NLP. That year's version of NLP. Right, so I had to write one, find some reasonable framework to do it. Now it's completely different. I'll talk about it a bit more in the NLP part. But things are changing very fast, right? And what was the lab, is no longer the lab. It's like plug and play now, right? So the rate at which the new AI techniques are created is astonishingly high, and so is even more astonishing is the speed at which they are getting into production. So which means that what is the gap between a PhD level researcher and a person who is able to code quickly, right? That is between the first and the second types here that implement algorithms from literature, right? It's actually fairly low. Okay, so you got to keep thinking about like whether it is worth the time to do it, because implementing from our literature is obviously one order of magnitude, perhaps half order of magnitude less complex than actually creating a new one. Okay, but both of them require excellent math skills, right? And even that ready-made functions, even faster is a ready-made function. So the gap between these three in terms of time, in terms of skill, is extremely high. These three levels, but in terms of time, right? What was like could be achieved only by somebody in the highest level. As soon as they do literature, it gets passed around because the rate of diffusion of knowledge is very fast. In a few months' time, and a few months later, a quarter or two later, totally, there's a ready-made function and model. Okay, so we got to be careful about the allocation of capital, allocation of resources, allocation of time on what do we spend on in terms of these three categories. And how can the faculty guide the students for an MLAI career? As I said, fundamentals are always important. It is quite difficult to undo habits of thought because you are not even aware of that. So if something fundamentally is messed up particularly in math, it's very difficult for you to for them to undo that. So fundamentals are extremely important, right? And I mean, people don't even know they don't know, right? So there is a big problem. And if they themselves don't know, then you can imagine a non-mathematician, right, or non-data scientist or non-AI guy, right? So there is this issue. So fundamentals are very important, and coding skills are essential. As I said yesterday, because you have to. I'm sure for 99, more than 99, maybe 99.9% of the time, without coding skill, you will not be able to make a mark. Of course, unless somebody is a really top-notch theoretician and all that, then things are different, right? But I think 99 out of 100 people conservatively, coding skills are important. If you are going to be doing anything in AI reasonably, right? I meant coding skills, not hacker level skills like they always seem to show in the movies. But can you get an algorithm running or not, given the pseudocode, right? And do you understand why that is happening, right? For these, the first two things are important: fundamentals and coding skills, right? And you can't code correctly if you don't know the fundamentals of math also, meaning like, it's scientific code. I done like, crystallographic, looked at crystallographic code for some time when my, as a postdoctoral researcher, and it's all Fortran, it was all Fortran code. And it's not something I would want to repeat for the simple reason. It's like you are afraid to touch the code. There are so many magic numbers, so many things there. It's very, very difficult scientific code, right? You have to know the science on it, right? So that's why the fundamentals are important. Coding skills are essential, right? So in order to make a mark on the world, right, you have to, in terms of the whether you're academia or not, communication skills are vital, and particularly because it's a highly technical subject. I see, for example, in AI, there's a concern about biases, as racial biases. Just the word bias, right? It makes it sound as if, yes, there is. I understand it from the layman's perspective, what a bias is and so on, right? But of course, there's a different version of bias, meaning of bias. Term, the same bias has a different meaning term in machine learning, right? But when you say bias of machine learning systems or AI systems, it's a very, very touchy subject, right? So the main problem is technical, right? But the framing is in such a way that one would think that the researchers are careless and so on, right? But it's not true, right? Somebody was asking me, we used to do, we still do medical prediction, right? This is all the US data, right? And this is a doctor here, a couple of doctors actually, Indian doctors have asked me, like, do you how do it fit for the Indian thing? You said bias. I said, we don't have Indian data. So what can I say? We don't have data here at all, right? So the basic problem is the data is not there, right? It's not as if we are biased. Yes, I understand, that is correct, but it is not due to any problem with us, right? But we have to communicate properly. So and whether it's academia or otherwise, communication skills are vital, and internships are very good for getting into the industry. So let's go over the different topics. Okay. So you have first is optimization. So I would want to go over a bit slowly, right, here, because what I want people to really understand is like not. As I said, it's not really aimed at the faculty. I just want them to understand what is most important for their students to know, right? Because as such, the at least the initial part, the math is like just straight, very, very straightforward, right? At least most of the math is very, very straightforward. But the amount of time I'm spending is in proportion to what I think is the importance that a student, how important the student should learn this extremely well, right? So so optimization is of course, like just convex optimization itself is a separate subject, and then you have so many different techniques, like dozens and dozens and dozens of techniques that are available out there. What a practitioner needs to know is the basics of the optimization very well, right? There are literally like new optimization techniques being developed like every week or every day, depending upon the frequency at which you check the literature, I guess, right? So but the point is, are they solid on their the fundamentals? If they are solid on the optimization fundamentals, right, then given a pseudo code of the optimization algorithm, right, they should be able to write the code. Okay, now surprisingly few people do it in, at least in production. I don't know what they do in academia, meaning like they write it, but I was surprised, right, that people do not do that, right, even given the pseudo code, right? So what are the fundamentals here, which I emphasize that they should know the fundamentals and then they should know the coding, right? So through that lens of fundamentals and coding, I'm just going through these steps. So whatever I show as a fundamentals, they should be able to code. Okay, if not, then there is a problem, right? What I'm saying is, I'm not showing autonomous driving. I mean, nobody is going to sit and, like, a single guy is not going to sit and do autonomous driving coding. But whatever I show, right, I really think that people should be able to put it on pen and paper and on laptop, and then put it in a production system, right? So that's a focus. I'm keeping a very narrow focus on this, more fundamental, but this is my attitude, right? If you can't do this, then there is one, it's not so much about your coding skills, because somebody with I mean, it's not about memory management and whatnot, right? It's not like huge systems that you are building. This is simply about like a certain mathematical code, right? So anyway, so first is convex optimization. They basically, it's about algorithmic training, right? All the prediction algorithms, classification algorithms, most of them run on a gradient descent, right? So and gradient descent itself is simple, definitely, but what is it that people need to know about gradient descent? What is the fundamentals? And as I said, the point is, can they code or not? If they can't code, then I don't believe it, okay, that they really understood it, or I can believe in what they say or do. Okay, so what is gradient descent? Basically, you have to find you are trying to find the weights of the system, the parameters of the system, a predictive system. Let's take just a simplest case. There are linear modeling. That what is the you want to understand? You initialize the weights at some random numbers, right? And then you want to understand what the cost is, right? So given the random weight, obviously the cost of the function is going to be some very high cost, right? So therefore, like, assume it's a convex surface, right? And there is only one global minima, right? A local minima is a global minima. There's only one global minima, right? So then you can go ahead with the gradient descent algorithm. So you have an initial weight, and then you find the gradient or at that initial set of weights, and then you basically go in the opposite direction, right? So you keep doing this. So there are two things, right? What is the direction of the gradient, and second thing is, what is the step size that you have to take, right? So now the step size, if you look at this diagram, it keeps reducing, right? So it realizes that it is nearing the minimum, and therefore it is basically it's reducing, right? So the step size itself is a function of the gradient here, right? So you have this gradient descent method. This is that you have the minimum cost, you have the derivative of cost, and the algorithm is simply basically given here, right? So for a linear regression model, basically the response is nothing but theta naught plus theta 1x, and then what is the cost function? It's basically the error, right? Square error, sum of the square errors. So you take the prediction, subtract it from the actual value, square it, and then sum it all over the m data points, average it out. So therefore that's a cost function. So you want to minimize this cost, right? And how do you do that? This cost, as was shown here, is J. In this particular case, J is given as a cost, and then J, you are looking at the gradient of that, right? So you have the gradient, you have J obviously depends upon the weight space is theta naught and theta 1, consists of two, it's a two-dimensional weight space. So you have J is a function of both theta naught and theta 1, depending upon what weight you give, the gradient is different, the error is different, the cost is different, right? So it's a function of that. So therefore, when you're taking the derivative, when you're taking the gradient, you have it's a scalar function of two variables, and then you're taking the partial derivatives, and you're getting two derivatives, and then you're getting and there's a step size alpha, right? Now a whole bunch of variants, how, what alpha do you pick? What is a procedure? What is a policy for doing it alpha? Does alpha vary? How much? Under what condition? And all those things, right? And when do you stop? All those things are there. But the point is, you want to, when you say convergence, like, for example, what is the threshold at which you stop, right? What does convergence mean? Are you saying it's zero, but there is numerical, right? So you might oscillate around the equilibrium point, right? So it could be minus 10 to the power minus 3 or 10 to the power minus 6. And then when you make a step there, it could become plus 10 to the power minus 6 error. Anybody who has done an ounce of optimization knows this, right? So then what happens, right? So okay, you keep changing the alpha, that is all right, that's one way. But even if you keep changing the alpha, there is still a possibility that you can overshoot. So what is the tolerance? Are you okay with this, right? So you repeat until convergence within a tolerance, right? Between theta j plus 1 and theta j, I would say, not theta j plus 1, I'm sorry, the first step, this value, what is the difference in the values between in the cost between the old and the new, right? So you do it, until you get convergence, right? It's a gradient descent algorithm. People should be able to code it. Okay, this takes 2 minutes to read, but if they are not able to do the coding, then they don't understand it. Okay. So here, what you to give you be more simpler. What is a gradient? It's basically operates on a scalar function to get a vector, right? It's basically the maximum rate of change at the point of the maximum rate of change of the function is at the point of the gradient, right? So here a scalar function of x, y, z. Therefore, it is partial derivatives of all of them. You have to do it, and then the overall gradient is simply that what is given here, right? It's del f is equal to dou f by dou x into x hat plus dot dot dot, right? And the Jacobian, right? See, the reason I'm telling all these basic things is, like I'll tell you right now, because I multiple times I had to code, right? And in a language that was not, it did not have these algorithms, right? So I'm assuming the any new thing that people have to code by themselves, right? So that's why. So J is a Jacobian, right? So it's basically you are getting the partial derivative matrix, right? Of the vector, right? F of x is a vector, so you'll have fn, f2, f3, f4, and so on. And then it is a function of a basically the vector, right? So that is x1, x2, x3, right? So when you take that, right, so you end up with a matrix, and this is the Jacobian, right? So and then you get the basically Jacobian of the gradient. You end up with a you end up with a Hessian, right? So this is a square matrix. Now, why do we need all these things, right? Again, you need this for coding, right? If you want to do a line search, right, a gradient descent with a backtracking line search, line search, okay, find the direction of the gradient descent, and then you move along that line. And again, how much is what is the direction you have to find out. And second is what is a step, right? But you are searching along that line, right? There are so many lines possible in that space, but you are searching along this line. So given this, they should be able to code. For this, they need to understand the prior concepts, basically, right? Hessian, Jacobian, gradient descent, and so on, right? Because what happens is, in 15 minutes, people look at that curve and say, yeah, that's all right, I'm done. I would strongly suggest next time you teach them, you make them code, and give them some problem where it could be it will be a context optimization problem, but then it can't converge because of numerical issues. Okay, so do that. That will be very and make it important, right? Not like, okay, some lab, one particular 5-minute exercise and all that. Okay, because in real life that's what's happening. Okay, so you have to make it work, right? Otherwise, you have to look at some 70-year-old paper or whatever. Okay. And then if they're able to do that, then you can give them better algorithms like this, limited memory or BFGS algorithm, right, which makes use of the Hessian, right, approximation of the Hessian, and so on. Okay, so this is something that people should be quite familiar with. So this is the basics of optimization. They should be able to do code all this. Okay. Let's move on to feature engineering. Feature engineering is extremely important. Even in the textbooks, I mean, in my, I was doing materials informatics in my grad school a long time back. And then we had all this chem informatics, the data sets that, chemical bond, length and distances. All those chemical bond lengths and distances will be practically be the same. So plus all these materials properties, right? So then what is the best feature? You have thousands and thousands of them. Okay. The word cheminformatics has, I assume nowadays they call it chemical data science or something. I don't know. Okay. But the cheminformatics, they had, there was one place where they had really a lot of features, right? So now, for example, in the protein unfolding thing that Google DeepMind has figured out, right? They still have the same bunch of bonds, etc., etc. They're using the same data set for proteins, but the computation capability is God alone knows 20 or 6 times more or something like that, right? So at that time, we had thousands of features. How do you select them, right? So we use, I mean, it's all the textbooks will say okay, log transform, right? You center it, you z-scale it, subtract the mean and then divide by the standard deviation, or you subtract the mean and then divide by the max minus minimum, or you subtract the minimum and divide by the max minus minimum, right? So many scalings are available, square root scalings. I mean, I was desperate enough at some point to try out, cube root and and so on, right? So the earlier transformations, right, and of course for certain models, these transformations do not matter at all, right? This is a pipeline, right? So certain things, it does not matter at all. If you're just using regression, how the heck does it matter whether it's center, unless you are using some elastic net kind of thing, where regularization, where the size of the coefficient matters, right? But many times, of course, logarithmic might matter, particularly in biology. They have, I was astonished when the first time I saw that they had log thing. I mean, if you do a log of a log and then you plot against a log of something else, everything will be flat in life. Any distribution will be flattened, I think. Okay. But these are the part of the toolkits. This feature transformation is a very old tool, if you will. Some of them we still do, of course, like z-scaling, etc. Not to be mocked at, but there is something that it's been in the toolkit for a long time. The other is that category encoder. Basically, you have age category. You okay, 0 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, 50 to 60, and so on. You have a age, and then you want to put them into categories, and then you do a one hot encoding, right? You basically say somebody is 25. So you say the 0 to 20 to 25 is 1, but rest of them are zeros. So you have let's say you have every 10 years you have a category, right? So you have 10 features, 0 to 10, 11 to 90 till 100 years, right? So for somebody in their less than 10 years old, the coding will be 1 followed by 9 zeros. For somebody in their teens, it will be 0, 1 followed by 8 zeros. Somebody in the 20s, it will be 0, 0, 1 followed by 7 zeros, and so on. So it's a one hot encoding. This is extremely common, and it is quite useful because, for example, in health cases of health, right, the age, the the output is really not a linear function of this. This will be, it will go up and down, or down and up, right? The relationship with the edge, right? So how do you handle that? You handle it by partly by converting into a category, right? So this category encoding, one-hot encoding is there everywhere, right? And the explosion of data is has already happened. It happened in cheminformatics and bioinformatics quite some time back. Now it is this orders of magnitude more, right, in every field, right? So what do you do about that? The other thing is, like, what you can do is, of course, principal components. Principal components is a double-edged sword. Yes, you can do it, but it's also kind of like sweeping all the dirt under the carpet. I try. I mean, one is for dimensionality reduction in terms of, like, you have 1,000 features, and then, like, you take the 1,000 principal components and take the first 10. Right? That is frankly very unsatisfactory, because why on earth do you want the first 10? Yes, they are the maximum variance, right? And they are uncorrelated with each other. But how about that is as an unsupervised thing, it's all right. But why does that got to do with, why should the first 10 principal components got anything to do with the response variable, right? Because this is all within the without the response variable, right? The principal components, right? So, but there is still principal component regression, and I got to say that is fairly robust. Even other things fail when there's basically due to collinearity. There's a lot of features, and you really can't figure out, which one is linear, collinear, and all that. This thing works, right? Explainability goes out for a toss, but it does work, makes it more robust, right? So principal components, either by selecting the principal components or by simply, like, making them not independent. Independent is, you have to have independent component analysis, but like uncorrelated, you're able to get out of the next pipeline, right? So that's a one good thing. Clustering, you can put them into clusters and then give them like a cluster label or the centroid of that as a feature, as features, right? That you can do. Grouping data is again quite useful. So many data, you just group them together. Even as this happens also, for example, in surveys, right? You have, like, 5 answers, right? For 5 questions. So like, how do you combine them, right? Grouping the data into some a logical, right, method is quite useful in feature engineering. Okay. Feature selection. In terms of feature selection, you have this. I don't want to call it ancient, but standard stepwise regression. Basically, you have forward, a backward combination, with f-test and t-test, depending upon the case. Some people say backward is slightly better because you are starting with a fully saturated model. Okay, fine. That is all right, but in the end, I would like them to actually something has to work better, and it has to be fairly stable. So then you have, like, other criteria, like archaic information criteria, Bayesian information criteria. Of course, adjusted R-square is always there. That's not R2 R-square. The difference between the AIC, BIC in terms of the formula is given underneath. Basically, K is 2 for AIC and BIC is a log, right? The justification is different. You are penalizing the complexity, essentially, right? Not only the performance, but also the model complexity, right? So all this is good, but what happens when none of them are, like, we should not get lost in the math, in the sense that there are, like, so many variants of this BIC, AIC also, right? But here's the thing, right? So you are in step 5. So you have 30 variables. Right now, you want to add one more variable, right? And there are like 5 variables which give you similar, let's say, AIC when you add that variable, or similar BIC when you add that variable. Why? Because these 5 variables are very similar to each other, right? So, so what do, right? Which one do you pick? Why, if you pick variable one in the next step, then what happens is the other variables become redundant. So now you want to argue like, both ways, like you can say like, they're all the same. So how does it matter what you pick? The other thing is why don't you combine them, right? But like, either way, there is some loss of intuition, right? Or some sort of a bias there, right? So like, why do you, I will say variable one, you say variable two, right? Then we take the average and it's like, what's going on, right? So none of them are complete solutions, whether it's AIC, BIC, or BIC, or WBIC, whatever, right? There's a whole bunch of them out there, right? They all have sound justification, but practically speaking, many of them are very, very similar and in performance, right? And you always have to keep an open mind on what is it that there is you want to use. You might want to use a bunch of them and then see what works, right? And what is the model that you get, like, what is the process, which process gives you the most stable set of models, right? Whether you use AIC or BIC, and so on, right? Whether you use backward and a combination forward. The one problem with forward and backward combination is they're really, 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 really slow, right? And then there is this best set. I mean, the concept is very, very simple, right? Take the best subset, but it is ridiculous in practice for any sensible data size. Okay, now there are papers written on it, fine, good for them, but frankly, like, even for forward and backward, it takes forever for data sets that we have. Never mind this best of them, right? So best subset, like, I have 10,000 features. What am I going to do with 10,000 features, right? I'm going to do backward selection of 10,000 features, right? So not really, right? So you got to keep that in mind, right? And you have feature selection from nonlinear methods, like for example, XGBoost has a feature importance. Random forest has a feature importance, right? Again, they sweep stuff under the carpet, but they look nice. At least they give an output saying, hey, these are the features that are important, right? Random forest gives, like, few metrics for feature importance, right? Like, hey, look, this is being used for most of the decision trees and so on, right? But whatever it is, there is what I'm trying to tell is, it's not only the math. You have to understand that there are very alternatives available, and then you have to pick and choose something. Okay. A data size makes some algorithm impractical. Absolutely, absolutely. See, in many of the stats, like, for example, start with small data, like, the machine learning repository, all this, like, they have small data, iris data set. What is wrong with the iris data set? Nothing. It's great for giving a concept. See, myself, I have, typically we deal with, like, a million people, literally, right? And the medical records of them, and each one of them will have, like, if you put them into code, it will be like 10,000 and diagnosis codes and 10,000 procedure codes. So very simple. Okay, you run anything. I'm not talking about your laptop. Okay, I'm talking about machines with 56 cores, not 56, like whatever, like 96 cores, 98 cores, and all that, 128 cores, Amazon machines, right? So it makes it what will work on your laptop beautifully, backward, forward, and all those many things, like, will work beautifully. There's nothing wrong with it. But when you actually try it out, unless there's a computational adjustment, there are parallelizations sometimes. There are very good parallelizations, for example, now inbuilt to the software, right? But data size makes a huge difference, and it all depends upon that particular algorithm also. So there will not be a stoppage to algorithm development. Okay, there's a huge difference between what is shown in the iris, what will work on an iris data set, and a real data set. If it works, great. You just close the shop for the day and then move on. But absolutely it makes a difference. Okay, and I'm not talking about only image data. No, there's real life data that we deal with, medical records data. Okay. One second. Oh, what happened here? Oh. Yeah, so you have this feature engineering, elastic net and lasso ridge. So what do you have here? Like, you have a penalty term for the, we have a lot of variables, and I really want to reduce the variables. You can penalize it. Yeah, I mean, you can either have this or two things are lasso and ridge, and then you can dial it down between 0% lasso, 100% ridge, or the other way around, or somewhere in between, right? That's elastic net business. You have this lambda parameters, alpha parameter. You have 1 minus alpha and alpha, right? So you have like the square, you got the ridge, and then that absolute value, you got the lasso, and then you basically dial it down. And what is the penalty with respect to the normal penalty for the performance? That's a lambda. You fiddle around with that, right? But you'll get some sensible things. So there's a good balance of features there. But again, this is the only way to do it? No. And lasso reduces the variables like to 0, the coefficients to 0. The other one just reduces the size, not the number of coefficients. So you have to be very clear on why you want to do it, not as if it's an answer to everything. You say like, hey, look, I want to really reduce the number of variables by using this elastic net, so I'm going for lasso, done. Because it cuts it down to 0. Now, are these 0 things really unimportant? Not really. You are getting some reasonable performance out, and then you will move on, right? So that you have to be careful about. Okay. And of course, you come to the kernel methods. The kernel methods, I was talking about reducing the feature space size, right? This is a reverse, right? You basically like, so what is complicated in the input space, 2-dimensional, let's say in this particular case, the toy example is an input space, which is 2-dimensional, and then you project it into 3-dimension in a certain way that they are separable, right? So that's the, that is just a projection, but like, what is the deal with the kernel? There's a kernel trick, right? So basically now if you are going to now what happens is the projected space, the higher dimension space could be extremely high dimension, right? So depending upon the kernel, right? Whatever Gaussian polynomial, a whole bunch of kernels are there. Depending upon the problem, it is appropriate, right? But the kernel trick is that basically you just compute to find out the similarity between 2 points, you just compute the cosine similarity. So it's a dot product, basically. It's a dot product. So the way you do it here is, instead of actually computing the high dimension, you have like the 100 dimensions, the higher dimension space, you are not really computing the higher dimension. Instead, you are computing only the dot product, right? In the original, using the variables in the original space, right? So that's a trick. So that the computationally you are somehow like, it's a trick because like you using it in the you are actually in the higher dimension, but then you are calculating in the lower dimension using the pretty much in the lower dimension using the dot product. Okay. One, of course, very important example is the support vector machine, where you are basically trying to you have the support vectors, which are basically, okay, you have these two classes. You have a hyperplane that separates them. Let's assume that clearly separable. So the vectors, the data points on class 1, which are closest to the hyperplane, are the support vectors. They are supporting that classification. And the other class, the red class, right? The two red points that are closest to this hyperplane are the support vector for that class, right? The red class, right? Yellow class and red class, right? And what you want to do is find a hyperplane that you want to maximize that margin, right, of that, right? So this is a support vector machine, right? Now this used to be very, very popular. Now it's not that much popular. 5 years back or so, everybody used to say just SVM on their resume. Believe it or not, I asked one guy, like, what is SVM? He said SVM and all that. He said he did not know the expansion. Okay, so he said, I just learned it like 2 days back. I don't know the expansion. So now like nobody bothers about SVM, right? It's all deep learning. But I am still talking about the SVM because you do need to know, all the tools, right? Who knows, like 2 years from now, instead of deep learning for something else would come in, right? So you really have to know all the tools. That's why the fundamental, even though there is software available, etc., you need to know all these things. Okay. SVM, you don't know how to code really practically, but then you need to understand the theory, right? Of that. The other part is Bayesian statistics. This is one strong link between class. Of course, it is by itself a separate subject, classical and Bayesian, but here, this also stays as an important link between the statistics and machine learning. The very famous, it's funny because I saw literally the original paper, 18th century paper on, right? It's hard to find this out from that paper, okay, the base paper, right? It's quite interesting. But anyway, so basically you have the prior, and then you have the prior data distribution, and then you have evidence coming along. That is the data, the likelihood, the data comes along, and given the prior and the data, basically you get a posterior, right? So the distribution changes, right? So you have basically P of A given B. Okay, so you can call one the evidence and one the basically the other thing to be the parameter also, right? So A and B have different. Here he says A and B, but you can have theta, E, and whatnot there, right? But it's very simple but extremely powerful concept, and I would like I don't know. I'm sure there are T-shirts with this equation on them. Okay, and this is one of those equations that really should be on T-shirts. At least from stats, it should be one of the top T-shirt equations, right? So the Bayesian treatment of linear regression, where do we use it? At least in a couple of 2 or 3 places, two simple, very simple examples are for regression and for experimental design. So one is the regression. What we have is it avoids overfitting problem, leads to So how do we do it, right? So you have a prior distribution of the weights, right? Prior distribution of the basically the weights, in the sense the parameters, right? Then given the new data, what is the posterior distribution, right? The prior could be Gaussian, it's a very flat Gaussian or a uniform distribution, and then the posterior will be the basically the conjugate. So you will get that, right? So there are standard analysis available, but you keep improving the estimate of the parameter, which is the distribution of the parameter keeps getting narrower, essentially, right? As we keep adding data to that, right? New evidence to that, right? So it's a very satisfactory way of setting up the problem, unless more so than classical statistics, in my opinion. Okay, so then you can also have an experimental design. So you do basically so you have a data points, and then you have again the parameter space, right? You have data space in the parameter space. So you are doing a bunch of experiments, right? So initially you want to have certain information, you target some information, so you do an experimental design. You make a choice, you perform the experiment, new data comes in, and then you modify the experiment itself, right? And then you redo it, because you have the screening. For example, you have a screening design, right? I mean, you can also do it the classical way, but what I'm saying is this is more, the beauty of this is the reason I'm saying that this is more of the machine learning side is you can kind of make it automatic, right? So that's one thing. One second. Oh, the a priori value. Oh, that's a fun part, right? So, I mean, yeah. So your a priori can be different from my a priori, right? So therein lies one of the problems, right? But typically, I mean, the thing is, it's not so bad as you think, because it's rarely we come to a situation where it's like two people are fighting it out along the a priori, right? Yes, it could happen, but generally speaking, it is something like, hey, something sensible, right? And if you have a problem with the a priori distribution, you change it and then see what happens, right? So I used to worry about it a lot, but it really does not, like, if there is enough data, there is enough data, it will work out, right? So you don't have to, yes, in principle, it sounds like very shaky in the sense like, hey, wait, the a priori is like, how can it be? Yeah, it can be uniform or what? Like, what is your height? Height is like what? Can it be 1,000 meters? Yeah, you can put, but then very soon after a few data points, it becomes pretty good. Okay, so don't have to bother about. Practically speaking, theoretically speaking, it looks like, too wide a range. Okay, it could be anything. Your height could be anything 0, to 1 mile height. But I mean, about something sensible. One could start with a human height, could be a priori, could be 0 to 100 feet. And after 10 pieces, it should be all right. It converges. Okay. The problem happens when before convergence, we say like, hey, look, one data point is, then it's a problem, right? But in practical situations, it's all right. Okay. And if there's so little data, there's so little data, you'll end up taking the mean or some simple thing anyway. So it's all right. Okay. In practice. Okay. So the other part is basically probabilistic graphical models. There are graphical models. This is related to the whole bunch of algorithms. Yeah. So this is related to graph theory. There's a whole bunch of algorithms in practical algorithms, computational algorithms based on it to understand, to be able to keep updating the models and so on. Right. You have directed and undirected models. Directed models are directed acyclic graphs, essentially, right? And then undirected, you want to understand the system as a whole, right? But in both these cases, what you want to understand is, one second, what is this? Yeah, what you want to understand is a conditional probability, right? See, the joint probability distribution, you have like, here, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4 variables, right? So the joint probability distribution is a total hassle to find out. X, one given x2, x3, x4, for all values of x2, x3, x4, and then the other way around, this a full probability distribution is practically a total hassle to find. But if you understand the relationship between the data, x1 is typically not related to x3 and x4 directly, right? What you want is like, you notice that, I mean, you can generally say everything in the world is interconnected, but really, I mean, if Joe, yes, I am sure that I am connected to Joe Biden or Prime Minister Narendra Modi somehow, but really, I mean, if Modi, I don't know what the Prime Minister is doing. I don't think it matters. This exact opposite of this butterfly effect, it's very cool to hear chaos and all that. But practically speaking, you have to use conditional probability. Okay, then that makes life easier, not more complex. Okay, so how is x1 related to? You find out the value of x2 given x1, right? Here you see the absence of link between x1, x3, x4, all that, right? So that is very important. That means they are not directly related. It's not a trivial statement to make, right? Otherwise, it will be, everything related to everything. That is really not a graphical model of any use. Okay. Now here we have only 1, 2, 3, 3 things, right? So you want to find out x2 given x1, and then x3 given x2, then x4 given x2, right? So that's it. You don't have to, and if you want to understand x4 given x1, then you go through x2. Okay, that's the idea. Examples of Bayesian network and Markov network, as I said, it's one is directed, the other is undirected. So you have like, in Markov networks, like for example, you have congestion. So is the congestion due to flu or hay fever, right? And also it's a rainy season. now if it's a rainy season, what are the chances that it is it's due there's you have flu, and what is the chance that it is hay fever, right? So you can reason given a couple of them, you can reason through the graphical models, right? So this is a fantastic way of doing it. So you look at the independencies, right? F is not connected to hay fever. How? Because conditioned on S, the season. Similarly, congestion is not connected to season. Conditioned on what? Given F flu and hay fever, and so on. Look at the independencies, even the Markov model, right? You have A independent of C given B and D, right? So therefore the joint distribution, the PSF or the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is very beautifully given. It's a factorization, right? So you have P of S. You don't need to find out P of S given F, H, M, C, everything. We just have to say P of S and then P of F given S, and then P of H given S, P of C given FH, P of M given F, right? The factorization is directly, all three of them are equivalent, right? Essentially, the graph representation, independencies, factorization, all of them are the same, essentially, right? It's just a way of representing it, right? Just a very beautiful thing. It makes life very simple in certain cases, right? And this brings us to the causal models. Why are we interested in this? Because there are causal models. A causes B, or A causes C through B, right? A causes both B and C. A causes B, and then B causes C and D, right? Or A and B cause C. So there are so many different models available, and right. So for example, anxiety, we understand that we have anxiety, you have insomnia, you have tiredness, right? So now anxiety could be due to insomnia, tiredness could be due to insomnia, but suppose you get rid of anxiety, that is like if you don't get you basically don't do you get rid of insomnia, what happens, right? So basically through a drug, right? So all these kinds of things can be answered by looking at some graphical model, not necessarily a PGM, but some graphical model, right? So we come to deep learning. So we basically have in deep learning, right? So these is graphical models and causal models are very important. They have now been combined with deep learning also. Okay. So it's not as if they are separate, they have been now combined, but I can't go over that. I'll just spend the next 20 minutes on the deep learning and NLP, and then I'll close it off. Things keep getting combined, right? So about deep learning, what is deep learning? You basically have, it's an updated neural network. It's like, I would say it's updated by Google. A neural network has always been there for a long time. They practically did, I mean, it was all right, the math was all right and all that, but they never really, I've tried so many times early in my career to use neural networks to improve my predictions for materials. None of them did nothing. And the computation used to be, quite high. I mean, basically you'll get the same answer, but after 2 days, until like, the early 2000s or so, then, basically a huge seismic shift happened, and suddenly they are useful, right? I mean, they're always useful, but not in a general sense, right? Only in certain cases they are useful, right? Because they used to say like, okay, it's only due to the brain and all that, right? So anyway, so you have an input layer, you have an output layer, and you have a whole bunch of hidden layers, right? All the arrows basically, the purple guy, the first hidden layer is basically a summed up version of the weighted sum of the input layer, right? And then it gets transformed, and then all these transform guys get weighted, summed up, and then transformed to the next layer, and so on, and you finally get the output layer, right? And what does each individual node look like? There's initially they were biological inspiration. I mean, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. right? They're inspired, yeah, fine, but they are not exactly the same, right? But it's a since it works, hey, it's fine, right? For example, like, for a long time, people are trying to fly using flapping wings because that's what birds do, right? But then at some point they figured out, like, okay, fine, by sheer trial and error, like, that is not the most efficient way of doing it. Then they have fixed wing aircraft, right? So similarly, okay, this is a reasonable thing to do, right? But not like 100%, right? So you have the summation of the weighted. So you have x1, x2, x3 as inputs. You weigh them all together, you sum it up, and then there is a you basically, if the sum is, in this particular case, a step function. If the sum is greater than 1, if the sum is greater than 0, you put 1, otherwise it's 0, right? Right now, it started with a sigmoid function earlier. Right now, that ReLU, and you take TensorFlow or any of those things, you can use any of these guys. Hyperbolic tan, and then sigmoid, ReLU, leaky ReLU, and whatnot. What is interesting is the ReLU thing works very well, right? It's dead simple, rectified linear unit, but it works actually quite well. So that's quite interesting why it should work that well, generally speaking. Okay. So that's the basic unit, right? So you have what is the deep learning? Basically a neural network where each one is each a layer has a whole bunch of nodes, and the nodes are just summation and then a transformation, right? With an activation function essentially, right? And one type of, I want to go over like two types of neural networks, is essentially like convolutional neural networks and recurring neural networks. The convolutional neural networks are mostly used now. I use both, and then they can be used in this together also. They are being used together also, but let's not get into that. This is a CNN business. So you have, like, you have basically let's take an image, and then, like, you take pieces of the image and then you convolute it, and then, like, you basically pull it together. You kind of get like a whole bunch of since you are doing it in different strides, different window sizes, and different window sizes, different strides, and different, perhaps, like, even polling functions. You end up being you end up having a whole bunch of features. Okay, so that's what you end up doing. Then you put them all together, you get the final output feature. Okay, so here the very simple example of a kernel. The input is 0, 0, 0. You take the kernel, it's basically a dot product. So you end up with 0 there, right? The second one will be the stride is shifted by async shifted stride. Then you have the you can use some only this 0, 0, 0, 1, and only the 3, 1 is 3 into 1, therefore 3, and so on, right? So you keep doing this, and there are you can sum it up or you can average it out. There are a bunch of things that you can do. Okay, so what else can you do here? You can basically, 1 second, I'm trying to. One second, I'm trying to push it to the next. Yeah, you got other factor is a stride. Basically, the strides, you can push it by 1 at a time, or 2 at a time, or 3 at a time, depending upon how do you stride it. You get the different sizes of the next layer. If you have stride 1, you have 3 layers. The 3 by 3, you are getting a 3 by 3. If the input layer is 4 by 4, and you have a window of 2 by 2, and if you have a stride of 1, you end up with a 3 by 3. if you have a 4x4, the same input and the same window, but you stride by 2, you end up with 2x2, right? So that's how you can get a whole bunch of different type of next layer, if you will, right? Convolution, right? The convolution is quite different, right? One second. And if you don't do the, depending upon the stride and the window, right, and the input layer size, you may not be able to, unless you do padding, you may not be able to get a uniform. You cannot be, you will not be able to treat the edges in the same way as the centers. They will only be partially be processed. So in order to fully process that, you want to do padding, right? So why am I saying all this? Because these are the basics of, if somebody wants to do a CNN, well, if you want, somebody wants to do neural network, definitely he needs to do CNN RNN. And if you ask to do CNN RNN, he definitely has to know this basic concepts. Okay. So these are the basic concepts for CNN, and this is used. I'm sure, you know, I think Professor Debna will be talking about biomedical research and all that. Imaging, for any imaging, you will end up with a CNN. Okay, I'm not talking about that exact use case, but this is the fundamentals that you can use for pretty much. If you are going to process an image using neural networks, you will be using CNN. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And if you are doing, yesterday I was talking about time series. I told you that, like, you know, time series, we had, you know, this also have RNN, right? I just talked about AR, MA, ARMA, and ARIMA, right? Here it is, what is the latest and the greatest is recurrent neural networks, right? So here you have an input X and then output O. You have a hidden layer, you know, H, and then you have, like, you know, U and W as the weights. But O, it's a time series, right? So you have O and then T minus 1, T, you know, T minus 1, T, O, T plus 1, and so on, right? And the input is also keep changing with time, right? So the weights that U and W keep the same, but then you have here, there's a relationship between the T minus 1 hidden layer on the teeth hidden layer, right? So there's V is there, right? So it unrolls. Okay, so this is a recurrent neural network. And let me go over, like, you know, a couple of types of variants of this three variants, right? One is just a standard RNN, and then the other is a long short-term memory LSTM, if you will, thing, and a GRU, right? Again, these are standard things. If you are doing any time series aspect in deep learning, then you will end up doing RNN, you will go do LSTM, you will do GRU. I mean, thankfully, you don't have to code all these things. You simply have to use one of them, but you have to understand the basics, right? So in the RNN, the working memory, see, in principle, the working memory goes forever. But in practice, what happens is there is all these things are typically trained by gradient descent, and the gradient vanishes. Okay, as time passes, the gradient vanishes. That angle goes off, right? So then what you need is like some short-term memory that you need, right? So which is what it you know, it gives. You need a long-term memory. I'm sorry, you know, some sort of long-term memory because of the vanishing gradient problem. Okay, so RNN just has a working memory. Here you have a long-term memory and a working memory. So you have three gates in an LSTM. You have a forget gate, which forgets into irrelevant information. You have an input gate, where you add new information, and an output gate, which is the updated information. The extra thing is basically the forgetting the irrelevant information, right? So the data, the more detailed information can be shown, can be seen. Circuit can be seen on the right hand side, essentially. Okay, so it's a whole bunch of, you know, sigmoids and hyperbolic tan, and, you know, the summation, rhetoric summation, right? Sorry. Yeah, and people who are interested in the actual number, right? So you can see that the C represents the memory, H represents the cell output, and then X represents the input. And then you have basically an element-wise multiplication and then element-wise addition, and then you have the transformations, basically the activation functions, sigmoid, you have the hyperbolic tab. Okay, and there are three things, right? As I mentioned earlier, you have the forget get, which is an extra thing, input get, and then output get. Okay, a variant of this is essentially GRU, right? Gated recurrent unit. Okay, so you have the simple RNN, LSTM, and the GRU, right? So how is the GRU different from the LSTM? The LSTM has a long-term memory and a short-term memory as separated out, right? They have, but the way it is sent to the circuit is they're all sent in different paths, right? Here it is put into the same path, long and short-term memory. Okay, so if you see the architecture, you have an update gate, you have a reset gate, right? So you have input output, fine. The hidden state is there, and then the new hidden state is there. So that's all common, right? So, but here what happens is there you have a in GR you have an update gate and a reset gate. In a way, it is simpler, and in practice, it works a bit better, but it's not obvious, when it will work better or not than LSTM. Okay. So again, people who are interested in the you see on the LSTM front you have the input, and other than the input and the output, you have two extra things, right? Here it's only one because they have been merged. The two memories have been merged. Okay, and the equations are given here, right? So now just go spend a few minutes on this chatbot or the NLP business, right? So now, as you said, earlier chatbot was very difficult. Now it's GPT-2, for example, a couple of years back they made it. A year back or so, GPT-2, not GPT-3, which write essays and whatnot, right? They made it public, right? The GPT-2 and all, right? And not only public, it's basically you can use it off the shelf, right? So, but that does not mean that you should not know the basics. So I'm just quickly going through 2 or 3 pieces there, very, very basic NLP items here before I wrap up. But this is important because what are the highest overview, right? What are the different components and where do we start, right? And you don't go to GPT-3 because they have it's unbelievable trillions of parameters and so on, right? You want to start at this point, right? You want to understand how do you do it without deep learning, what is the basic components of NLP, and then move on. Once you learn that and then you're able to do it, you can move on, right? Parallelly, you can build systems fairly easily because it's all ready-made, right? So, but to deepen your understanding, you need to do both, right? You need to build systems with GPT-2 because it's plug and play. At the same time, you want to do the theory brick by brick, right? So, what are the 3 basic components? You have a natural language understanding of the chatbot that basically whatever text you input, it should understand it, and then it should understand what the context is and what you mean and all that, and then you have a dialogue management, and then it has to communicate to you in natural language, which is the generation part. Now we have built for our company, for our customers, a chatbot, and we continuously train it and we continuously improve it. The technology is it's very mature, and off the shelf stuff that you can build. It's more of an engineering problem now than a mathematical problem. Even 2 years back, this Stanford NLP project, you used to have separate modules and all that, and in order to use them, it's a hassle. But now it's not true. But let me go over the very basics of the NLP, like 2 or 3 items. You start with the bag of words. Basically, you have a sentence. The concept, I'll give you like 3 concepts which is essential to start with. The bag of words concept, like how do you characterize a sentence? you use basically what the words are, right? What words are there on the counts, right? Then you can understand the relationships between them. One next level is like you don't look at, you not only look at the bag of words, but you look at the n-grams. N-grams meaning, what unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams for n equal to 1, 2, and 3. So what are the unigrams here? Each word is a unigram. Bigrams is like each 2 words, consecutive words is a bigram. So how does it, why does it matter, right? The point is like, what follows this is, what is the conditional probability of, is following this? What is the conditional probability of A following is? What is the conditional probability of sentence following A? And so on. So these conditional probabilities are basically built upon, these grams, right? And the third concept that I would like to just very briefly touch upon is the term frequency, inverse document frequency concept, right? So if a term is repeated a lot of times in a particular document, then it is in a way important. Okay, if it is common amongst the large set of documents, right, then what does it mean, right? So these two separate things, basically one within the document term frequency, other is across the document, right? So using these, right, and combining them both, we have a TF-ID of concept, right? So you have like, the highest TF may indicate importance. These are the basic things that predate any NLP business, right? Then came NLP, one early version of NLP. This is not still deep learning. It is basically very shallow network, right? Couple of layers of network, which basically word to vec. Each word was converted into a vector, right? Word to vec, right? Using a shallow neural network, using 2 methods. One is continuous bag of words and other is skip gram. Now, continuous bag of words is given the context, word t-1, t-2, t+1, can you figure out what the particular word, the gap in the center is, okay? Given the basically the basket of words, bag of words, can you figure out that word, CBOW? The inverse, given that word, can you figure out the context, right? Which is on the right hand side. That's a skip graph. That word is skipped, but you want to understand the context, right? So given these two things, using one of these, you make a neural network, using one of these concepts, make a neural network, and then understand, make the word into a vector, right? And why do you need it? Because it's now a vector space. Once you have a embedding, you no longer care about the origin was a word. Okay, now it's a vector. That's all you care about. Then you look at the similarities, right? So the vector similarities, right? Which are close, which pairs are closer, and so on. That's what you're seeing here. China is linked to Beijing, Russia is linked to Moscow, and so on, right? And how can this be used even further other than the chatbot, for example, or within the chatbot, for example, internally we are looking at medical ontology, right? You can read in our company, for example, we are looking at medical ontology where we are looking at the reading natural language documents, and then we are looking at like the ability to basically parse this document and understand which words are near to each other, which symptoms are near to the treatment, and so on. Okay, knowledge extraction. For all this, you need NLP. Okay, this again is AI. Okay, now there are other stuff. This is not the deep learning is not the final word in not the first word or the final word in AI. It's a big word. But there are other things coming up, that are very new, directly in AI or related to AI in math or in related fields. One is such thing as topological data analysis. You basically look at the shape of the data and then extract that shape, if you will, right? Extract metrics based upon that shape. That's one thing. The other thing is, for example, right now the field is starting to pick up. You use AI in math using higher order logic for automated theorem proving, and most of it has nothing to do with deep learning. Just to be very clear, again, there is logic has to be developed. First order logic, second order logic. Now quantum logic has to be higher order logic, and then now quantum logic has to be developed. Again, nothing to do with deep learning. There is that other part of math, category theory, the most abstract of all mathematical concepts. They can be used for databases. Again, nothing to do with deep learning, right? All these things are there. And to end it off, right? A just now published paper, Advancing Mathematics by Guiding Human Intuition with AI, a fantastic paper, right? A beautiful amalgamation of AI and math, serving both, right? I encourage people to read it. So I'd just like to end it by saying, look, this is just the beginning, and it's an awesome beginning. And I think that's the beginning of going to be a very long and very fruitful dialogue between mathematics and AI. Okay. So with that, I thank you all, and any questions I can take.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for this enlightening session. I think there are a couple of questions. One, I think you have already answered. That is, how do we obtain the a priori values? That I think already you have answered. One more is there. So we refine as we progress and collect the data.
Yes, absolutely, right? That's the point of the Bayesian, right? So this also similar to the online learning, right? So you have online learning algorithms where you don't have all the data earlier, right? For example, you have online PCA, right? So we have you have an initial guess based upon the initial data, and then we keep refining the data, right? Of course, online is slightly different also because you have to change with the time. Here is the Bayesian thing is cumulative, right? So the absolutely we refine as we progress and collect data. Absolutely, yeah.
Any other questions from any other participants for sir? Okay,